The war did not end with a scream. Humanity always imagined its breaking point would be loud, dramatic, visible from orbit. Instead, it arrived quietly, in ration lines that never shortened, in manufacturing shifts that never ended, in prayers repeated so often they lost meaning but not necessity. Somewhere between the 13th hour of a 16-hour work cycle and the 4th generation born without ever seeing an unpolluted sky, something inside humanity finally began to give way. Not courage, not faith, something subtler and more dangerous. The belief that endurance itself still meant survival. In the age now whispered of as Warhammer 50K, the Imperium did not collapse overnight. It thinned, it frayed, it learned how to function while already broken, and that lesson would cost it more than any invasion ever could. If you're still listening, if this slow unraveling feels familiar rather than distant, then walk this path with me. Share this story with others who understand that the Imperium's greatest tragedies are not always written in explosions. Stay with this channel, because some histories are not about how wars are won, but about what they leave behind in those who live through them. The day began the way all days did now. Not with dawn, but with the shift siren tearing through recycled air, its tone calibrated to cut through exhaustion without offering urgency. On Hive Carthax Primus, the sun was a rumor buried under kilometers of ferrocrete and prayer-stained steel, and morning was defined not by light, but by obligation. Men and women stirred from bunks stacked like cargo. Joints aching before work had even begun, lungs already burning from air that tasted faintly of oil and old smoke. Somewhere far above, atmosphere processors groaned as they struggled to filter poison into something merely unhealthy, and that effort alone was treated as a blessing. I rose with the others because not rising was no longer an option anyone remembered having. The ration bar in my hand was stamped with the Imperial Aquila, its surface cracked and chalky, its flavor an afterthought. It dissolved slowly against my tongue, leaving behind a bitterness that lingered long after it was gone. No one complained. Complaints required comparison, and there was nothing left to compare this to. Hunger had become a constant background sensation, like gravity, noticeable only when it briefly eased. The corridor outside the hab block pulsed with movement as thousands funneled toward their assigned sectors. Red lumen strips flickered overhead, casting faces into harsh relief. Eyes sunken, skin sallow from generations without true sunlight. Vox grills barked reminders in clipped height Gothic, prayers masquerading as instructions, instructions framed as prayers. Work was worship, endurance was devotion. These phrases have been repeated so often they no longer sounded like doctrine, only like facts. At the transit junction, I passed a shrine wedged between two load-bearing pillars, its candles guttering weakly in recycled air. A servitor knelt beside it, mechadendrites twitching as it scrubbed soot from a relief of the emperor's visage. The flesh portions of its face sagged with age, augmetics whirring softly as they compensated for failing nerves. I wondered, not for the first time, whether it remembered being human. The thought felt dangerous, so I let it go. The manufacturing floor swallowed us whole. Heat slammed into my chest the moment the pressure seals parted, thick with the smell of promethium and hot metal. The noise was constant, a layered roar of pistons, conveyors, and distant detonations from test ranges that never slept. My station waited where it always did, a control panel worn smooth by hands that were no longer alive, overseeing a line that stamped shell casings by the thousands. Each one was identical. Each one would be filled, shipped, and fired somewhere far away by someone whose name I would never know. Hours blurred together, hands moved by habit rather than thought, fingers responding to machine rhythms drilled into muscle memory over decades. There was no sense of progress, only throughput. When a casing jammed, I cleared it. When a warning rune flashed, I acknowledged it. When a coworker collapsed 2 stations down, Medicae servitors arrived with efficient indifference, lifting the body away as the line continued to run. Downtime was heresy. Silence was worse. During the sanctioned pause, I leaned against warm steel and drank from a condensation pipe, water tasting faintly of rust. Conversations around me were quiet, stripped of anything that might resemble hope. No one spoke of victory. That word had grown abstract, something officers and data slates used, not something that fit into lived experience. Instead, they spoke of quotas met, of shifts survived, of children assigned to hab blocks closer to the upper levels, as if proximity to cleaner air was the same thing as a future. Somewhere beyond the hive walls, the Astra Militarum fought and died in numbers too large to picture. We knew this because transports came back lighter than they left, and because casualty tallies scrolled endlessly across public screens, digits climbing faster than anyone could count. The war was everywhere and nowhere at once, a constant pressure that shaped every decision without ever revealing its face. By the time the sirens sounded again, signaling the end of the shift, my arms trembled with fatigue that sleep would not fully touch. I joined the flow back toward the habs, past shrines now crowded with workers murmuring rote prayers, lips moving without conviction but with precision. Faith, like work, had become a matter of muscle memory. That night, lying on my bunk with the distant thunder of orbital guns vibrating through the hive's bones, I realized something had changed. Not suddenly, not dramatically, just enough to notice. For the first time, the thought of tomorrow did not feel heavier than today. It felt identical, and in that sameness, something honest and terrible took root. Sleep did not arrive so much as it claimed me, dragging consciousness down into something shallow and fractured. Dreams came in pieces, not visions, but echoes of machinery, pistons cycling without purpose, warning runes flashing too late to matter. I woke before the siren, heart already racing, body anticipating the sound the way scar tissue anticipates pain. Around me, the hablock stirred in near silence, dozens of lives resetting themselves without ceremony. Someone coughed until it became a wet rattle. Somewhere else, a child cried and was quickly hushed, not with comfort but urgency. Noise invited attention, and attention rarely arrived alone. I washed my face in cold water that smelled faintly of disinfectant and metal, watching my reflection ripple and distort. The person staring back looked older than I felt, lines etched deep by strain rather than years. I tried to remember a time when days felt different from one another, when change meant something other than reassignment or loss. The memory slipped away before it could settle, worn smooth by repetition. Nostalgia had become inefficient. The siren sounded, and we moved again. This time, the interruption came midway through the shift. A tremor rippled through the manufacturing floor, subtle enough that the machines did not immediately compensate. Casings rattled on conveyors. A few warning runes flickered, then stabilized. We paused, hands hovering, waiting for instruction that did not come. The tremor passed, leaving behind a silence so brief it felt imagined. Then the line resumed, louder than before, as if to erase the moment. Later, whispers spread through the floor in the only way whispers could hear, carried in glances and half-sentences exchanged during sanction pauses. The sector had gone dark, not damaged, not under attack, just dark. No Vox traffic, no data flow. The screens updated after a delay, marking it as temporarily unavailable, a phrase that had begun to carry too much weight. We all understood what it meant. Another place written off quietly so that others could continue pretending to function. I thought of the shell casings sliding past my station, identical and endless, and for the first time wondered where they would not be fired. Which battles no longer needed ammunition because there was no one left to pull the trigger. The thought lingered longer than it should have. It felt like a crack, thin but unmistakable. Toward the end of the shift, a new servitor appeared on the line. Its movements jerky, its augmetics mismatched, as if assembled in haste from whatever components had been available. Its flesh portions were fresh, too fresh, the skin still bearing the faint discoloration of recent surgery. I did not ask where it had come from. No one did. Questions slowed work. Work was survival. On the return march, the shrine near the transit junction had been expanded. Another relief had been bolted into place, another set of candles flickering weakly. The inscription beneath the Emperor's likeness spoke of sacrifice as renewal, of loss as proof of devotion. I read the words carefully, not out of faith but habit, and felt nothing. Not anger, not comfort, just recognition. The words had been adjusted again, tuned to fit the current moment. Doctrine adapted faster than people. That night, the orbital guns were silent. The absence was more unsettling than their thunder had ever been. I lay awake, listening to the hive breathe around me, air processors cycling, distant machinery groaning under loads it had been carrying for centuries. In the quiet, the thought returned, uninvited and persistent. If tomorrow was the same as today, and today was the same as yesterday, then at what point did endurance stop being a virtue and become a kind of surrender? The siren would answer that question soon enough. Yes, the siren answered before dawn, sharp and absolute, slicing through the hab block with mechanical indifference. Whatever question had lingered in the quiet was crushed beneath obligation, as all questions eventually were. We rose again, bodies protesting in small, manageable ways, the kind of pain that could be ignored because it had become familiar. Familiarity was the Imperium's most reliable anesthetic. On the way to the manufactorum, the corridor screens flickered with updates from the wider war. Front lines shifted in abstract geometries, colored lines advancing or retreating without context. Numbers scrolled past too quickly to read in full, losses compressed into digits that robbed them of weight. Somewhere, entire regiments ceased to exist between one refresh and the next, and the display moved on without pause. I watched long enough to feel the shape of it settle in my chest, then looked away. Staring did nothing. Staring never changed the outcome. The work that day was heavier, though the tasks were identical. Machines complained more often, warning runes blinking with increasing frequency. Maintenance crews arrived late or not at all, and when they did appear, they worked with the same exhaustive precision as everyone else, patching failures rather than fixing causes. Replacement parts were rationed now. Some sections ran on components older than anyone alive, coaxed into continued operation through ritual as much as repair. I followed the prescribed motions, hands steady, mind distant, aware that the line would not stop unless it physically could not continue. Midway through the shift, a supervisor collapsed near the central conveyor, his body folding in on itself without drama. The line slowed just enough for Medicae servitors to extract him, augers scanning, mechadendrites administering stims with practiced efficiency. For a moment, I wondered if he would return, reassigned, patched together like so many others. Then the line surged back to full speed, and the question answered itself. If he returned, it would not be to this station. If he did not, the line would still run. There was a moment, brief and almost invisible, when I caught myself moving without thought, responding to alerts before they fully registered. My hands knew the work better than my mind ever had. The realization should have been comforting. Instead, it felt like another quiet loss. Skill without awareness was efficient, but it was also hollow. I wondered how much of me was still required to keep this body functioning, and how much had already been replaced by routine. At the end of the shift, the siren sounded again, and this time it felt less like release than punctuation. We filed out past the same shrines, the same flickering candles, the same inscriptions promising meaning in suffering. I did not stop to pray. Neither did most of the others. Faith had not vanished. It had simply become ambient, like the hum of machinery, always present, rarely examined. Back in the hab block, I lay on my bunk and stared at the underside of the level above, its metal scarred with old impacts and hastily patched cracks. Somewhere deep in the hive, something groaned and shifted, the sound echoing like a tired sigh. I thought again of the day just ended, of how nothing about it stood out except the fact that it had passed. No triumph, no disaster, just continuation. That was when it struck me with quiet certainty. This was not collapse. This was adaptation. Humanity was not breaking in a single dramatic moment. It was learning how to exist in a state of permanent damage and calling that endurance. And that understanding, more than any alarm or invasion, felt like the true beginning of something far worse. Faith arrived on Hive Carthax Primus the same way everything else did now. Scheduled, regulated, and inseparable from labor. It was impossible to say when belief stopped being a refuge and became another obligation, only that the change had been gradual enough to feel inevitable. Shrines multiplied the way structural braces did, filling gaps where something had begun to sag. In corridors, in lift cages, even between manufacturum stations, the Emperor's image watched with the same unblinking patience as the machines. No one questioned the presence. Questioning required distance, and distance was a luxury no longer available. The sermons came through the Vox grills during shift changes, voices layered with static and reverence in equal measure. They spoke of duty as love, of exhaustion as proof, of sacrifice as the purest form of gratitude. The words were familiar, their cadence worn smooth by repetition. I listened because listening was expected, and because not listening felt conspicuous in ways that could invite trouble. Around me, heads bowed with practiced synchronicity, lips moving through litanies learned before reading, before writing, sometimes before speech itself. There was comfort in the structure, or at least there had been once. Now it felt like weight. Faith under load behaved differently than faith in desperation. It did not flare or falter. It compressed. Every prayer added pressure. Every sermon another layer of expectation. Belief became something to be carried rather than felt. Its mass increasing with each passing year. I wondered how much it could bear before something gave way, and whether anyone would notice the difference. During sanctioned rest, a priest walked the manufactorum floor, his robes marked with oil stains and ash, his voice hoarse from hours of recitation. He spoke softly to individuals as he passed, offering blessings calibrated to context. Strength for the tired, obedience for the restless, gratitude for those who had lost someone recently. When he reached me, his eyes lingered a moment longer than necessary. He spoke the Emperor's name, pressed a metal aquila into my palm, and moved on. The object was warm from his touch, its edges worn smooth by countless hands before mine. I held it longer than required, feeling its weight, its solidity. It was real in a way most things were not anymore. The thought unsettled me. Faith was not supposed to need proof. It was supposed to be proof. I returned the aquila to its chain and resumed work, the machines welcoming me back with their familiar roar. Outside the manufactorum, the public squares filled during mandatory observances, bodies packed tight beneath towering statues whose scale dwarfed comprehension. Prayers rolled through the crowd in waves, each voice blending into the next, until individuality dissolved. The Emperor was thanked for victories no one could locate on a map, for sacrifices whose details were classified, for survival framed as mercy rather than inevitability. I spoke the words because silence would have stood out, and because the words themselves no longer demanded belief, only participation. At night, the shrines glowed softly, candles burning low, their smoke adding another layer to already thick air. I watched people kneel out of habit rather than desperation, their expressions blank rather than fervent. Faith had not died. It had stabilized, settling into a shape that could endure indefinite strain. That realization frightened me more than open doubt ever could have. Because faith that can survive anything can also justify anything. The next shift awaited, and with it, another round of prayers timed precisely to the machinery they accompanied. The Emperor endured. The Imperium endured. And somewhere beneath the weight of it all, something human learned how to endure without asking why. The pressure did not ease after that. If anything, it became more refined, less overt, like a weight redistributed, so evenly it was harder to identify where it pressed the most. Faith seeped into spaces it had not occupied before, not as revelation, but as infrastructure. Schedules included prayer cycles the way they included maintenance checks. Data slates flashed litanies alongside productivity metrics. The Emperor's name became punctuation, inserted into sentences so frequently it lost the sharpness of invocation and became instead a habit of speech. I noticed it first in myself. Words of thanks rose to my lips automatically when a machine's cycle completed without fault, when a shift ended without incident, when a ration bar tasted marginally less bitter than usual. Gratitude had become reflexive, detached from joy or relief. It felt safer that way, an offering made preemptively, as if faith were a tariff that had to be paid before misfortune could be allowed to pass. I wondered when gratitude had stopped being an emotion and become a transaction. The priests adapted as well. Their sermons grew shorter, denser, stripped of flourishes that required attention or reflection. They spoke in phrases designed to slide past exhaustion rather than confront it, each word chosen for durability rather than inspiration. Obedience was framed not as surrender, but as efficiency. Doubt was described not as heresy, but as waste, a misallocation of mental resources better spent enduring. The rhetoric was careful, almost kind, and that kindness unsettled me more than threats ever could. During one observance, a man near the front collapsed mid-prayer, his voice cutting off abruptly as his body gave way. The crowd shifted instinctively, creating space without breaking formation. Medicai's servitors arrived, lifting him with practiced ease, and the prayer continued around them, uninterrupted. No one looked away. No one stopped speaking. Faith flowed around the disruption the way everything else did now, accommodating failure without acknowledging it. I found myself studying faces more closely after that, looking for cracks, for signs of resistance or despair. I found none that lingered. People looked tired, focused, resigned, but not broken in any obvious way. The machinery of belief had done its work too well. It had given everyone a place to stand, even as the ground beneath them eroded. I wondered if that was mercy or something far colder. One evening, as I passed a shrine newly installed near the Havelock lifts, I noticed the inscription had changed again. The wording emphasized continuity over triumph, endurance over reward. It spoke of the Emperor not as a savior who would deliver humanity from war, but as a witness who endured alongside it. The shift was subtle, but deliberate. Hope had been reframed as persistence. Victory had been replaced by survival as an end in itself. I knelt without thinking, hands resting on cold stone, eyes fixed on a face carved to appear both compassionate and distant. I searched myself for feeling and found only a steady calm, the kind that comes from knowing what is expected and doing it well enough to avoid notice. The absence of conflict inside me felt wrong, like a wound that had healed too cleanly. Faith had not failed me. It had succeeded in a way I was not sure I wanted. As I rose, a thought surfaced, unbidden and dangerous in its clarity. If belief could be engineered to bear this much weight without breaking, then it could be engineered to carry even more. There was no upper limit to how much could be asked, only how effectively it could be normalized. The Emperor endured, yes, but so did the systems built in his name, and those systems had learned how to extract everything without appearing cruel. The next day's shift began with a new litany piped through the Vox grills, its words unfamiliar, but its cadence instantly recognizable. I repeated it with the others, voice blending into the mass, feeling the comfort of anonymity settle over me like a cloak. Faith under load did not demand passion. It demanded compliance. And compliance, I realized, was becoming indistinguishable from survival. The days that followed blurred into a single extended observance. Work and worship braided so tightly they could no longer be separated without tearing something essential. I stopped thinking of prayer as something that interrupted labor. It was labor. The cadence of litanies matched the rhythm of machines with unsettling precision, syllables rising and falling in time with pistons and conveyor belts. Even silence had been ritualized, scheduled moments where no one spoke, no one moved beyond what was strictly necessary, as if stillness itself were an offering. I noticed how correction replaced punishment. Where once a misprayer or a faltered response might have drawn sharp reprimand, now it was met with gentle redirection. a hand on the shoulder, a murmured reminder. The system no longer needed fear to enforce belief. It relied on habit, on the deep human desire not to stand out when standing out carried no benefit. Faith had become invisible enforcement, and that made it nearly impossible to resist. One cycle. A young woman joined our section of the manufacturing floor, her movements awkward, her eyes still sharp with something like curiosity. She stumbled over a response during a Vox-led litany, her voice half a beat late. The sound should have vanished into the noise, but I saw heads turn, not in anger, but concern. A priest approached her after the shift, his manner calm, almost paternal. They spoke quietly. She nodded often. The next day, her responses were flawless, her expression as neutral as everyone else's. I never saw that spark again, and I could not say whether it had been extinguished or simply buried deep enough to survive. That night, I dreamed of a shrine room without walls, its candles stretching endlessly in all directions. The Emperor's face repeated across every surface, identical and unchanging. I knelt in the dream, not because I was compelled, but because there was nowhere else to stand. When I woke, the feeling stayed with me longer than the images, a sense of enclosure that no amount of movement could shake. The sermons shifted again, their focus narrowing. Where once they spoke broadly of humanity's destiny among the stars, now they emphasized immediacy. The next shift, the next prayer, the next ration. Eternity was no longer framed as a future reward, but as the endless present, a line without horizon. It was comforting in its way. Thinking small made endurance manageable. Thinking big invited despair. I began to understand why heresy terrified the Imperium more than invasion ever could. An enemy at the gates could be fought, quantified, eventually repelled or absorbed. Doubt, once articulated, spread unpredictably, infecting routines that relied on unthinking repetition. Faith under load could tolerate exhaustion, grief, even mass death. It could not tolerate the question of why it was all necessary if necessity never ended. The realization did not make me rebellious. It made me cautious. I learned to monitor my thoughts the way I monitored machines, watching for irregularities, correcting deviations before they escalated. Self-censorship became second nature, an internal servitor scrubbing away anything that might slow me down. The efficiency was frightening. I was becoming exactly what the system needed. One evening, as I passed a shrine near the transit junction, I noticed fresh flowers placed at its base, their colors shockingly vivid against the grime. Someone had gone to great effort to acquire them. The gesture felt almost transgressive in its beauty. I stood there longer than necessary, staring, feeling something stir that I could not immediately name. It was not hope. It was recognition, a reminder that variation still existed, however rare. The flowers were gone the next day, replaced by a small plaque commemorating anonymous sacrifice. The color vanished, subsumed into sanctioned meaning. I moved on with the others, my pace steady, my expression composed, faith humming quietly beneath, everything else like a system running exactly as designed. And in that flawless operation, I sensed the approach of something heavier, something that would test not belief, but the structures built to carry it. The test did not arrive as crisis. It came as adjustment. One cycle, the Vox grills announced a revised observance schedule, their tone unchanged, their phrasing careful. Prayer blocks were extended by several minutes. Not enough to disrupt production quotas, but enough to be noticed by bodies already operating at their limits. The change was framed as alignment, a refinement meant to better synchronize labor and devotion. No one protested. No one even murmured. We adjusted, because adjustment was the one skill the Imperium had perfected beyond all others. Those extra minutes accumulated. Fatigue deepened in subtle ways, not dramatic enough to justify complaint, but constant enough to erode focus. I saw it in the small errors that crept into the line, in hands trembling slightly longer before steadying, in eyes that took a fraction of a second more to refocus after each litany. The system compensated. It always did. Servitors filled gaps. Overseers redistributed load. Faith absorbed the blame, reframing exhaustion as spiritual trial rather than structural strain. I realized then that belief was no longer merely supporting the Imperium's machinery. It was being used to mask its limits. Where resources ran thin, faith was thickened. Where systems failed, doctrine expanded to cover the fracture. The Emperor endured, yes, but increasingly as an abstraction stretched across too many functions, asked to justify what could no longer be sustained materially. The weight settled differently after that realization. Each prayer felt heavier, not because I doubted it, but because I understood its purpose more clearly. Faith was no longer aimed upward. It was directed inward, shaping behavior, smoothing resistance, ensuring continuity at any cost. It was a load-bearing structure now, and like all such structures, it could not be allowed to crack. Late one night, long after lights out should have claimed the hab block, I lay awake listening to the hive breathe. The air processors cycled with labored regularity, their rhythm almost prayer-like in its persistence. I thought of the flowers that had vanished, of the young woman's lost spark, of the man who collapsed mid-litany while the prayer continued around him. None of these moments had disrupted the system. That was the problem. Faith under load had succeeded too well. It had learned how to endure anything by redefining endurance as virtue, suffering as proof, and continuation as victory. And in doing so, it had removed the last meaningful distinction between survival and submission. When the siren sounded again, I rose with the others, voice ready, hands steady, mind disciplined. I was no heretic. I was no rebel. I was exactly what was required. And that, more than any doubt, felt like the true danger. The Imperium did not think of itself as fragile. It thought in terms of scale, and scale had a way of disguising weakness as inevitability. From the floor of the manufactorum, that illusion was easier to see through. Machines failed not in spectacular fashion, but in small, accumulating ways. Bearings wore thin. Power fluctuations lasted a fraction longer than they should have. Warning runes became familiar enough to ignore until they weren't. Survival here was no longer about keeping systems intact. It was about deciding which failures could be tolerated. The work changed subtly, though no official announcement marked the shift. We were no longer told to maximize output. We were told to maintain acceptable loss. The distinction mattered. Production quotas were adjusted downward without explanation, their new targets framed as strategic realignment rather than necessity. Entire lines were shut down and never restarted, their crews reassigned or quietly absorbed elsewhere. The hive did not shrink. It redistributed. I began to notice the absence of certain shipments. Raw materials arrived later, or not at all, replaced by alternatives of lower grade, their flaws compensated for by additional steps in the process. Each workaround added strain, but the system absorbed it, layering inefficiency atop inefficiency until the original design was almost unrecognizable. The machinery still functioned. That was enough. Outside the manufactorum, the effects were harder to ignore. Transit delays stretched longer. Entire hab blocks were reassigned to different power grids, their lighting dimmer, their air thinner. The changes were always temporary, always justified as optimization. Weeks passed. Nothing reverted. Temporary had become the new permanent, and permanence no longer required explanation. The Astra Militarum recruitment drives intensified, their messaging stripped of heroism and focused instead on necessity. Service was no longer framed as honor, but as function. Bodies were needed where systems could no longer compensate. I watched transports depart fuller than they arrived, carrying men and women whose faces mirrored my own exhaustion. Some waved. Most did not. Everyone understood what rotation meant now. It meant disappearance delayed, not avoided. Servitors multiplied in the spaces people once occupied. Their presence was efficient, unsettling in its normality. Flesh and metal stitched together in configurations that prioritized durability over dignity. They worked without pause, without complaint, without the need for belief. I wondered if that was why they unsettled me so deeply. They represented an endpoint, a form of survival that required no endurance because it required no self. Decisions filtered down without names attached. A supply route was rerouted, and an outlying sector lost heating for 3 cycles. A Medicae allocation was adjusted, and recovery times lengthened just enough to reduce return-to-work rates. No one called these choices sacrifices. They were referred to as necessities, and necessities did not invite moral scrutiny. The machine did not ask whether it was just. It asked whether it still ran. I found myself thinking less in terms of people and more in terms of throughput. How many could be spared from one area to stabilize another? How much delay could be introduced before collapse accelerated rather than slowed? The thoughts came unbidden, efficient, frightening in their clarity. This was how the Imperium thought now. Not out of cruelty, but out of habit formed under endless pressure. One cycle, a data slate malfunctioned at my station, freezing mid-update. For several seconds, the line hesitated, caught between instruction and execution. In that pause, I felt something close to panic ripple through the floor. Not fear of punishment, but fear of indecision. Uncertainty had become the enemy. When the slate rebooted and the line resumed, the relief was palpable and deeply wrong. That night, as I lay in the hab block listening to the distant rumble of heavy transports, I understood the shape of what we had become. The Imperium was no longer fighting to win. It was fighting to delay losing in a way that could be managed. Survival had been mechanized, stripped of narrative, reduced to process. And processes, once established, do not care why they exist. They only care that they continue. The realization settled into me slowly, like dust accumulating in corners no one checked anymore. The machinery did not feel cruel. That was the most disturbing part. Cruelty implied intent, and intent implied choice. What surrounded us now felt closer to inertia, a system moving forward because stopping would require a decision no one was willing to make. Survival had become automatic, and automation, once achieved, resisted interruption more fiercely than any enemy. The next adjustment came without warning. Power cycles were shortened across the hive, lights dimming earlier, machinery entering low output states that stretched work shifts into odd, exhausting rhythms. We adapted. We always did. Sleep fractured into smaller segments, rest becoming something snatched rather than granted. I watched people learn how to function on less without ever articulating that they were doing so. The body learned first. The mind followed out of necessity. On the manufacturing floor, a section of the line was decommissioned permanently. The machines were not removed. They were simply powered down, their housings sealed, their control panels marked with sigils denoting strategic reserve. Strategic reserve was another word that had changed meaning. It no longer meant future use. It meant acceptance that revival would cost more than abandonment. We walked past the silent machines every day, their stillness a quiet accusation no one acknowledged. The servitors assigned to replace that section were efficient, tireless, and deeply unsettling. Their movements were precise to the point of inhumanity, their augmetic limbs clicking softly as they worked through cycles without pause. I found myself watching them more than the line, not out of fascination, but recognition. They were the logical endpoint of everything we were becoming. Endurance without fatigue, function without doubt, survival without identity. I caught my reflection again in a polished steel panel and felt the comparison settle uncomfortably close. How much of me was still choosing this life, and how much was simply following programmed response? The question lingered longer than it should have. I buried it under routine, the way everything else was buried. Outside the hive, the war continued its distant, abstract roar. Casualty tallies climbed. Fronts shifted. Names disappeared from rotation lists. The Astra Militarum became a tide, rather than an army. Units flowing into gaps faster than they could be recorded. Victory was mentioned less often now, replaced by terms like stabilization and containment. Language adapted to match reality, sanding down words that no longer fit. One evening, A transport failed to arrive. Not late. Not damaged. Simply absent. The schedule updated without comment. Its slot removed as if it had never existed. People waited longer than usual at the transit junction, then dispersed when it became clear there would be no announcement. I stood there for several minutes after most had gone, staring at an empty platform, feeling the weight of that quiet erasure. Something had been lost, and the system had already moved on. Back in the hab block, I listened to the hum of reduced power and thought of all the decisions being made far above me. None of them dramatic, none of them malicious, all of them irreversible in aggregate. This was how empires died, not in fire, but in optimization. By the time anyone noticed what had been sacrificed, there was no surplus left to mourn it with. As I lay down, muscles aching in ways sleep no longer fully addressed, one truth pressed itself forward with uncomfortable clarity. Humanity was not being crushed by the war. It was being reshaped by the effort to survive it. And reshaping, once begun, rarely stops at the original design. The reshaping became visible in the smallest places first, where margins had always been thin. Medical wards began to feel less like spaces of recovery and more like sorting chambers, bodies assessed not for healing, but for return potential. I saw workers discharged with limbs still trembling, eyes unfocused, stamped fit because fit had been redefined. Those who could not be returned quickly enough were redirected, reassigned to lighter duties that somehow still consumed them completely. Those who could not be redirected vanished into administrative silence, their absence absorbed without ceremony. I learned to recognize the look people carried when they realized they had been calculated rather than cared for. It was not anger. Anger required energy few could spare. It was a kind of quiet recalibration, the moment when someone adjusted their understanding of their own worth to fit the system's expectations. After that, they moved differently, spoke less, conserved themselves the way the Imperium conserved resources. I wondered how many such moments it took to change a population permanently. On the manufacturing floor, new protocols appeared on our data slates, written in language so technical it disguised their intent. Failure tolerances were widened, error thresholds adjusted, loss ratios normalized. Each change was small enough to justify, each one framed as temporary, but together they rewrote what acceptable meant. The machinery groaned under configurations it had never been designed to sustain, and we groaned with it, bodies mirroring the strain of steel and servo motors pushed beyond their intended lifespan. I began to hear the term attritional equilibrium used by overseers and logisticians, spoken with something like pride. It described a state where losses and replacements balanced just enough to prevent collapse. Not growth, not recovery, balance. The idea chilled me. Equilibrium implied intention, a decision to accept endless loss as long as it was predictable. Humanity had not just adapted to war. It had optimized itself for it. The realization followed me beyond the factory walls. In the hab block, maintenance crews stopped repairing cosmetic damage entirely. Cracks were sealed only if they threatened structural integrity. Paint flaked. Lighting failed and was never replaced. Children grew up learning which corridors to avoid, not because they were forbidden, but because they were no longer maintained. The environment taught restraint better than any sermon could. One cycle, a shipment of replacement parts arrived that did not match any known specification. They were functional, mostly, but their tolerances were rough, their materials inferior. We integrated them anyway, adjusting workflows to compensate. The line slowed slightly, then stabilized. Another compromise absorbed. Another step away from the original design. I wondered how much of the Imperium's infrastructure still resembled what it had once been, and how much had become an improvised scaffold holding up a memory. At the end of that shift, I stood for a long moment watching the line run without intervention, machines feeding machines, feeding machines, the human presence reduced to oversight and correction. The system no longer needed us the way it once had. It needed us as buffers, as flexible components that could absorb unpredictability. We were the soft material pack between rigid systems to prevent catastrophic failure. That understanding stayed with me as I returned to the hab block, as I lay listening to the hive's reduced power hum, as I watched the lumen strips dim earlier than they used to. Humanity had not been spared by the Imperium. It had been amortized, and in that accounting, something essential was being written off without ever appearing on a ledger. The accounting reached a point where it no longer bothered to pretend it was temporary. One cycle bled into the next without even the courtesy of revised projections. What had once been framed as emergency measures were now embedded into standard operating doctrine, their origins forgotten, their consequences accepted as baseline. The machine no longer remembered what it had been designed to do. It only remembered how to keep moving. On the manufacturing floor, I noticed that fewer supervisors walked the lines. Not because oversight was unnecessary, but because oversight had been absorbed into systems. Auspex arrays tracked productivity, error rates, and fatigue indicators with indifferent precision. Data slates updated automatically, recommendations issued without human commentary. When a worker's performance dipped below tolerance, reassignment orders appeared without explanation. People vanished from stations the way parts were swapped out, seamlessly, without disruption. The absence was noted only if it caused imbalance, and even then, the response was procedural rather than personal. I felt myself thinking in those same terms more often, not deliberately, not proudly, just efficiently. When someone failed to report, my first thought was not concern, but compensation. Who would fill the gap? How long before the line stabilized again? The realization landed with a dull thud. The machinery had not only reshaped the Imperium, it had reshaped me. The war outside continued to grind forward, but it felt increasingly irrelevant to daily life. Front lines mattered only insofar as they altered supply flows or recruitment quotas. Victory announcements arrived sporadically, vague and unsupported by visible change. Losses were constant, but so abstract they no longer pierced the routine. The war had become environmental, like radiation or gravity, something one adapted to rather than confronted. One evening, I stood at the edge of a decommissioned sector, its access sealed behind warning sigils and prayer strips. Beyond the barrier lay darkness, machinery frozen mid-task, conveyors halted with unfinished work still resting upon them. It struck me then that this was the future being practiced everywhere in pieces. Not destruction, but suspension. Systems paused indefinitely because restarting them cost more than abandoning them. Humanity was learning how to live surrounded by its own unfinished efforts. As I turned away, the thought crystallized with unsettling clarity. This was not survival in the traditional sense. Survival implied recovery, a return to something recognizable once the threat passed. What we're doing now had no end state. It was maintenance of decline, carefully managed so that collapse never arrived all at once, but also so that renewal never became possible. By the time I returned to the hab block, the hive had settled into its dim, power-saving hush. I lay on my bunk, listening to the distant, uneven heartbeat of an empire too large to stop, too damaged to heal. The machinery of survival had succeeded in its purpose. It had ensured that humanity would go on. And in doing so, it had quietly erased any memory of why going on had once mattered. The first rumors did not arrive through official channels. They never did. They surfaced instead in the pauses between sanctioned speech, in the quiet moments when work had ended but rest had not yet claimed the body. Someone mentioned a vox delay that could not be explained by distance alone. Another spoke of reinforcement schedules that vanished from data slates without being marked lost or rerouted. These were not accusations. They were observations offered carefully, without emphasis, the way one might comment on weather patterns that felt subtly wrong. On Hive Carthax Primus, the Astronomicon was spoken of constantly and rarely thought about. It was background certainty, the unseen beacon that made navigation, communication, and coordination possible across the vastness of the Imperium. But lately, certainty had softened at the edges. Astropaths were said to be collapsing more frequently, not screaming or burning out as legends described, but simply failing, their messages thinning into incoherence before fading altogether. Official statements blamed strain, enemy interference, statistical inevitability. None of that contradicted what people felt. It just did not explain it either. I noticed it in the delays. Orders arrived late enough to matter, but not late enough to be catastrophic. Supplies reached us after adjustments had already been made to account for their absence. The system compensated so smoothly that the disruption almost went unnoticed. Almost. What unsettled me was not that things arrived late, but that no one seemed surprised when they did. Expectation had shifted quietly, preparing us for absence rather than reliability. In the shrines, the language adjusted again. Prayers no longer spoke of guidance or illumination. They emphasized endurance without reassurance, obedience without explanation. The Emperor was invoked less as a voice and more as a presence that listened but did not respond. The shift was subtle enough to deny intent, but consistent enough to feel deliberate. Faith adapted to silence the way it had adapted to exhaustion. Some whispered that terror itself was distant in ways that could not be measured, not unreachable, not absent, simply far, as if stretched across too many demands at once. Others dismissed such talk as morale decay, a symptom of overwork and isolation. I did not know which explanation frightened me more. One implied a change in reality. The other implied that nothing had changed at all, and we were simply noticing it too late. Data slates updated with increasing frequency, but with decreasing clarity. Directives were broader now, leaving interpretation to local authorities who lacked the context to interpret them well. Decisions were made closer to the ground, not because autonomy was granted, but because coherence no longer traveled cleanly across distance. The Imperium functioned, but it did so unevenly, pockets of overreaction and neglect forming wherever guidance thinned. I thought of the decommissioned sectors, the silent machines, the shipments that never arrived. None of it was framed as loss. Loss required acknowledgement. What we were experiencing felt closer to diffusion, authority, and certainty spreading so thin they became indistinguishable from absence. The Imperium was still issuing orders. It was still fighting wars. It was still demanding obedience. But the voice behind those demands felt increasingly distant, as if speaking through too many layers to retain urgency. Late one cycle, I stood at a shrine where the candles had burned down to stubs, their smoke staining the Emperor's carved features. I listened to the murmur of prayer around me and realized something with quiet certainty. Silence did not always mean failure. Sometimes it meant redirection, and sometimes it meant that the center could no longer hear the edges clearly enough to answer. The rumors persisted, not as rebellion or heresy, but as shared unease. The Imperium was still there. The Emperor still endured. But between command and compliance, a widening gap had opened, filled not with chaos, but with quiet. And quiet, in an empire built on endless noise, was never harmless. The quiet spread the way damp did, seeping into places never designed to hold it. On Carthax Primus, Vox traffic began to arrive in uneven clusters, hours of nothing followed by bursts of overlapping instruction that contradicted themselves just enough to cause hesitation. No one called it confusion. That word carried implications no one wanted to entertain. Instead, it was referred to as saturation lag, as if the problem were volume rather than coherence. We adjusted our routines accordingly, learning which directives could be acted upon immediately and which were safer to wait on until clarification arrived, if it arrived at all. Astropaths became rarer sights, not because they were gone, but because they were increasingly secluded, their quarters sealed more often, their movements restricted under layers of protocol and prayer. When one was escorted through a corridor, heads bowed instinctively, not out of reverence alone, but out of something closer to discomfort. The strain showed in their posture, in the way their eyes failed to focus on the same plane as everyone else. They looked less like conduits and more like survivors of something no one else could perceive clearly enough to describe. Official bulletins reassured us that the Astronomicon burned as brightly as ever, that Terra remained vigilant, that the Adeptus Custodes still stood watch over the golden throne as they always had. The words were precise, canonically sound, and carefully framed. They did not lie. They also did not answer the question no one asked aloud. If everything was unchanged, why did it feel as though messages took longer to arrive the farther they had to travel? Not just in time, but in meaning? I saw the effects ripple outward in small administrative decisions. A shipment of Promethium was rerouted twice before arriving. Its accompanying orders amended by 3 different authorities, each acting on partial information. By the time it reached the hive, the need it was meant to address had already been compensated for through rationing and substitution. The fuel was stored, logged, and largely unused. No one marked it as waste. Waste implied error. This was simply misalignment. In the manufactorum, we learned to read between directives, to infer intent from phrasing rather than content. Orders that emphasized urgency without specifics were acted on aggressively. Those heavy with qualification were approached cautiously. It was an art, this interpretive obedience, and those who mastered it were quietly elevated, not for initiative, but for their ability to function in ambiguity without drawing attention to it. Rumors grew more elaborate as they spread, not because people embellished them, but because silence invited imagination to fill gaps. Some spoke of regions where the Astronomicon felt dimmer, not extinguished, but distant, as if viewed through fog. Others insisted the light was unchanged, and that the problem lay entirely with those trying to see it. A few, very carefully, suggested that the Imperium had grown so vast that even the Emperor's will, as filtered through prayer and machinery, could not reach every corner with equal strength anymore. These words were never written. They did not need to be. The shrines reflected the shift. New litanies emphasized patience in the absence of clarity, loyalty without immediate reward, faith without confirmation. The Emperor was praised not for guidance, but for endurance itself, his continued existence framed as the ultimate example to be followed rather than a source of intervention. It was not blasphemy. It was adaptation. Doctrine had learned how to survive silence. One night, standing beneath flickering lumen strips, I realized the rumors were not dangerous because they questioned authority. They were dangerous because they normalized distance. They taught people how to function without response, how to obey without expecting acknowledgement. An Imperium that could do that did not need to be loud. It only needed to continue. And somewhere between command and compliance, that silence settled in, patient and enduring, waiting to see how much it could replace before anyone noticed what had gone missing. The missing pieces became easier to ignore once they stopped being named. Silence, when it persists, reshapes expectations. On Carthax Primus, people learned not to wait for answers that would not come. Decisions were made locally, framed carefully as compliance with intent rather than instruction. No one claimed authority outright. That would have been noticed. Instead, authority diffused, spread thin across layers of necessity until responsibility itself became difficult to locate. I saw it when a Hablock lost power for 2 full cycles. The outage was logged, categorized, and quietly accepted. No escalation followed. No Vox inquiry demanded explanation. Maintenance crews rationed lumen strips and sealed off lower levels, redirecting residents upward where systems still functioned. The adjustment was efficient, humane, even, and entirely unofficial. When power eventually returned, nothing reverted. The sealed levels remained sealed. Temporary solutions, once proven survivable, became permanent by default. The same pattern emerged everywhere. Patrol routes shortened. Training cycles compressed. Entire categories of request were removed from data slate menus. Not denied, simply made impossible to submit. No announcement marked their disappearance. Those who noticed adapted. Those who did not never realized they had lost the option. Silence, it turned out, was easier to manage than refusal. In the shrines, the absence took on a strange texture. Candles burned lower, replaced by lumen icons and recycled incense designed to last longer with less upkeep. Sermons referenced the Emperor's watchfulness without implying response. his endurance without implying intervention. It was subtle enough to remain canonically sound, framed as humility rather than resignation. The faithful knelt, rose, and returned to work without expecting signs. Expectation itself had become a liability. Astropaths, when they appeared at all, looked hollowed by effort that did not resolve into clarity. Their messages arrived fragmented, stripped of nuance, reduced to priority markers and partial coordinates. Interpretation fell to those already burdened with decision-making, and mistakes multiplied quietly. Not catastrophes, misalignments. A regiment deployed to reinforce a world already lost. Supplies delivered to a sector that had stabilized weeks earlier. Each error was survivable. Together, they formed a pattern no one dared name. I began to understand that the Imperium had not gone silent. It had become asynchronous. Command still flowed. Faith still endured. War still consumed. But the rhythm that once bound them together had slipped. Response lagged behind need. Meaning trailed behind action. And in that delay, people learned how to operate without confirmation, how to obey without feedback, how to endure without reassurance. One cycle, standing beneath a shrine whose vox grill crackled, but did not speak, I felt the full weight of it settle in my chest. This was not abandonment. It was distance made functional. The center still existed. Terra still stood. The golden throne still endured, tended by the Adeptus Custodes as it always had. But the Imperium had grown so vast, so strained, that even certainty now arrived diluted, its edges blurred by the sheer effort of transmission. The rumors did not incite rebellion. They did something far more dangerous. They taught people how to live without answers, how to accept silence as normal, how to build a world where guidance was optional as long as survival continued. An Imperium that learned that lesson could endure almost anything. But endurance, I realized, was no longer proof of strength. It was proof that breaking could be postponed indefinitely, quietly, until no one remembered what wholeness had ever looked like. The postponement became policy without ever being declared. On Carthax Primus, the rhythm of life settled into something flatter, less dramatic, but heavier for it. Days no longer carried the tension of waiting for orders or relief. They carried the dull certainty that whatever guidance arrived would come too late to matter fully, and that whatever did not arrive would have to be replaced by improvisation. The Imperium had taught its people how to fill the gaps themselves, and now it relied on that lesson more than any decree from Terra. I watched local authorities grow more confident in their quiet autonomy. Not arrogant, not defiant, but practiced. They learned how to phrase decisions as inevitabilities rather than choices, how to cite precedent without sourcing it, how to invoke the Emperor's will in ways so broad they could not be contradicted. Nothing they did was technically wrong. That was the brilliance of it. The silence from above did not create chaos. It created 1,000 small Imperiums nested inside the larger one, each operating just well enough to avoid notice. The people adapted with the same grim efficiency they had always shown. When supplies ran thin, diets changed. When patrols shortened, neighborhoods learned which hours were safest. When Vox traffic faltered, rumors replaced announcements, and rumor became a kind of social infrastructure, unreliable but immediate. No one trusted it completely, but everyone listened, because listening cost nothing and might save something. Truth, in this environment, was less valuable than timeliness. In the manufactorum, production targets shifted again, this time without explanation or ceremony. We met them anyway. We always did. The system no longer required justification. It required momentum. I felt myself slipping further into that logic, accepting adjustments as natural rather than imposed, internalizing the idea that survival depended not on understanding the whole, but on performing one's function well enough to remain necessary. One evening, I stood at a viewport overlooking the hive's inner voids, watching traffic lights blink in slow, uneven patterns. Somewhere out there, beyond layers of steel and atmosphere, fleets moved according to plans already outdated by the time they were received. The Astronomicon still burned. The Emperor still endured. But between that distant certainty and this immediate reality lay an expanse of silence filled with human effort, patching, compensating, enduring. It occurred to me then that the Imperium had achieved something extraordinary and terrible. It had built a civilization that could continue even when its own voice grew faint. Faith filled the gaps. Habit smoothed the edges. Machinery absorbed the shock. Humanity learned how to function without reassurance, without clarity, without the expectation of reply. The rumors of a silent Imperium were not warnings. They were descriptions, not of absence, but of adaptation to distance, so complete it no longer registered as loss. The center had not fallen. It had become irrelevant to daily survival in ways no enemy could have engineered deliberately. As I turned away from the viewport, the thought settled with a weight I could not shake. An Imperium that no longer needed to hear itself speak could go on forever. But it would do so without ever knowing what it had become. The end, when it came, did not feel like an ending. It felt like recognition. By the time the idea took shape, clearly enough to name, humanity had already lived inside it for generations. Endurance was no longer something earned in moments of crisis or heroism. It was ambient, embedded in architecture, ritual, and language. On Carthax Primus, people did not speak of surviving the war. They spoke of surviving the day, the shift, the ration cycle. The scale had collapsed inward, not because people lacked imagination, but because imagining anything larger had ceased to offer return on the effort it required. I saw it in the children most clearly. They moved through the hive with a confidence that came not from hope, but from familiarity. They knew which stairwells worked, which lumen strips flickered before failure, which times of day the air tasted less bitter. They did not ask what the sky looked like beyond archived images. They did not ask what peace felt like. Those questions had no practical application. They learned instead how to endure efficiently, how to fit themselves into a world that would not bend for them. The Imperium still taught history, but it taught it selectively. Victories were summarized, losses abstracted. The past was presented as a series of necessary sacrifices leading to the present, which was itself framed as another necessary stage on an unbroken path. There was no promised resolution at the end of that path, only continuation. The implication was clear enough without being stated. Endurance was not a means. It was the goal. I thought often of the word break and how misleading it was. Breaking implied a moment of failure, a visible fracture. Humanity had not broken that way. It had redistributed its fractures so evenly that none of them stood out anymore. Pain had been spread thin, diluted across trillions until it became manageable. Loss had been normalized. Silence had been institutionalized. The system worked precisely because nothing failed all at once. One cycle, the manufacturing line I had worked for decades, was shut down permanently. Not due to damage, not due to enemy action, simply because its output could be replaced elsewhere more cheaply. We were reassigned without ceremony, our tools logged, our stations sealed behind prayer strips and hazard sigils. I stood there for a long moment after the others had left, staring at the inert machinery, its surfaces still warm, as if it had been alive moments before. There was no anger in me, no grief sharp enough to demand expression, only a quiet understanding. This was what endurance produced when stretched far enough. Not collapse, but disposability. The system did not hate us. It did not even judge us. It moved on, because moving on was what it had been built to do. In a hab block that night, I listened to the familiar hum of reduced power and realized I no longer measure my life in days or years. I measured it in usefulness, in how long I could continue performing a function before the calculation shifted again. That awareness should have horrified me. Instead, it felt ordinary. That was the final victory of endless war. Not the destruction of humanity, but its redefinition. The Emperor endured. The Imperium endured. Humanity endured. The words still held power, but their meaning had narrowed. Endurance no longer pointed toward anything beyond itself. It was a closed loop, feeding on its own necessity, justifying its own continuation. There was no villain in this story, no singular moment to resist, only a system that had learned how to survive by teaching everything within it to do the same at any cost. As I closed my eyes, a final thought surfaced, unbidden and unresolved. Perhaps this was what humanity would carry into whatever future remained. Not glory, not triumph, but the quiet, relentless ability to go on, even after the reasons for doing so had been worn smooth and forgotten. And perhaps that, more than any enemy or catastrophe, was what endless war ultimately left behind.